All right, welcome to a special edition of Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Now, Ian has asked a very peculiar prompt that I don't have in front of me, but it is a good enough and interesting prompt that I can remember the gist of it offhand. He essentially says, if we can compose poetry from pre-existing phrases, as Homer does in the Iliad. The Iliad is comprised of dactylic hexameter, and a lot of it is fabricated from preset phrases that were designed to fit within that structure. Then if we can write poetry from prefabricated metaphors in terms of phrase, like swift-footed Achilles and so forth, then what is to stop AI from learning to write poetry? And he offers as a possible explanation, maybe it's because AI lacks the phenomenological experience of the world to really give depth and concreteness of experience in a way that a human poet might. But it can still draw from an existing list of metaphors, And I have another friend who said, well, AI can tag, phenomena in the world, like a blade of grass as being green, as being blade-like. It can tag it with a smell association, and it can create an index of all these associations. And you might be able to get, sometime in the future, very interesting poetry coming from AI. It's possible. Now, it's such an interesting prompt because it has puzzled me for years. One of my great stylistic influences, and he hasn't been as influential on my writing as perhaps he should be, as perhaps I'd like him to be, is George Orwell. And specifically George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, which I think I've recommended to people before. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I'll leave a link in the description of this video so you can go look that up, because it's so worthwhile. But the thing that Orwell is complaining about in bad writing, and this is prose writing, this is forming arguments and polemics and so forth, is people using stale metaphors. People who write in an almost AI fashion. People who have a list of prefabricated phrases, so the sentences seem to kind of write themselves. And you can end up with very funny metaphors that don't make any sense at all. I think one of the examples Orwell gives is the fascist octopus has sung its last swan song. And like, if you think about that for a moment, you're imagining an octopus singing. This is nonsensical. Whoever wrote this sentence wasn't thinking about what they were writing at all. They were just piecemealing together hackneyed, pre-existing phrases. And the danger, Orwell thought, to that is that the phrases can do their thinking for you, and you can actually make sloppy thinking with your sloppy writing, which is its own kind of dangerousness. Now, the question here is that what Homer's doing? Is that what Homer's doing? And if so, why have we elevated Homer so highly? Why is he like the foundation of Western literature and perhaps Western thought and culture? Full stop. And there's a sense in which, at a literal level, he is. But if you break the... Apologies, it's a little sweaty out here. If you break a sentence down, even a sentence you construct yourself out of regular words, and you think carefully, like Jordan Peterson with Maps of Meaning, about every single word, those words are prefabricated. You You didn't come up with those words yourself. They are pre-existing words that that you fit together in a sentence, and you hunt in your mental vernacular for a word that will fit this purpose you're trying to do. You're not coming up with words unless you're Martin Heidegger. You're not coming up with words or Dr. Seuss for that matter. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. You're not coming up with words usually to describe the original thought that you're trying to have. Does that mean you're doing this thing that George Orwell's worried about? Not necessarily. No, I don't think it is. You might be constrained in a weird way that George Orwell is anticipating, but it doesn't mean you're committing the sin of sloppy thinking and sloppy writing that George Orwell's talking about. And in the same way, in a work with as grand of as epic, we might say, of a scope as the Iliad, the prefabricated phrases begin to take on the quality of words, and you can fit them together with all of the complexity and thought that an ordinary person would put together a sentence. So if you have read the Iliad, you will know, or the Odyssey for that matter, right, and many epic poems, you will notice this pattern where someone pulls back a bow and they release the arrow from their bow, and as the arrow is in flight going towards its target, the poet takes a moment, say, and he released the arrow from the bow that he got when he was a boy from his grandfather who won it in a tournament in Sicily. It was a great tournament against this archer, and it goes into this extraordinary long backstory about the history of this bow, where it came from, why this bow is significant, and it gives this depth and richness to the scene where this bow is being used by this person in this moment to shoot at this other person. And that, you can say, well, the construction of the dactyls, the construction of the lines is all made of prefabricated phrases. But there's nothing in those prefabricated phrases that directs the trajectory of that passage, of that digression, of that epic digression. We'll call it, that's a good word for that. That's what I'm going to call it from now. An epic digression, when he makes these massive digressions about the backstory of this character or this object. And that's really what it is that George Orwell is describing as worried about, is the pre-constructed nature of the phrase itself altering the trajectory of thought and conclusion and the tone of the writing. That's the danger. And it's a matter of degree. There is something inherently epic in the sound of dactylic hexameter. I can't do it as well as some of the guys online nowadays, but that it's very it's very galloping, it's very driving, but it's this slow driving thing. It has the sound of inevitability to it, unlike iambic pentameter. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It's lighter, than dactylic hexameter. A good English example of dactylic hexameter, one of my favorites, one of the only poems I know offhand that's in dactylic hexameter in English, because dactylic hexameter is really for Greek, is The Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league onward into the valley of death. Valley, shadow, getting my poetry mixed up there. That's very, that captures the rhythm of the horses charging, and it has that hoof beat to it almost. And maybe that, structure drives the trajectory and the feeling and the tone of the poem in some way. Who knows? Maybe it's inescapable in some way. But when you read the Iliad, and especially when you read it juxtaposed with other works like that. You don't get the sense that the word choice, like swift-footed Achilles, is like driving the thinking. And people will point out internal contradictions in Homer, much the way that you can point out internal contradictions in the Bible. I think that might be a sign of a sign of visionary integrity, which sounds strange, but if you were to allow conflicts between details of the story change the portrayal in the grand scheme of things, that would violate the larger picture, the big view of what it is the author's trying to do. But if they allow for imperfections in the details, imperfections in the minor descriptions, so that we can fit within the poetic structure, and still convey this grand scheme, then you've got something beautiful going. So I think it has to do with the grandiosity of the scale at work there. And I think what you find in George Orwell's negative examples, in his examples of bad writing, is the writers not only don't have a grand vision, not only do they not have a large view of what it is they're trying to convey, they don't seem to have any vision at all in many cases. They're just saying words to express disagreement. But they often don't even know why they're disagreeing. They can't express even what it is they're disagreeing about. They just have this slop of prefabricated metaphors. And I think it's a judgment call as to whether the use of the prefabricated phrases works or not. Sometimes it does, but you have to have the same poetic sense necessary to create an original turn of phrase or original metaphor of your own. It takes that same skill to judge whether an existing prefabricated phrase is appropriate for a given context or not. And so what we see with many bad writers is that inability to judge. So they'll use a phrase that sounds kind of sophisticated, but it doesn't quite apply. And sometimes they're kind of close, but it's just not right exactly. And they don't even have the wherewithal necessarily to be like, it's not exactly this, but it's like this. Or something you might hear like Jordan Peterson say. They'll just put out these metaphors or these phrases that Gen Z kids might call like cringe, and they can't exactly explain why, which is its own mirror version of the problem. So assuming I've been coherent so far, what's to stop AI from doing this? I feel like AI passed the Turing test this year, maybe last year, I don't know. But it wound up being very underwhelming, passing the Turing test, this thing that computer scientists and philosophers of mind have looked forward to for decades, if not like a century. Because Turing was 40s, 30s, 40s, somewhere in there. It wound up being so underwhelming because it turns out you don't have to think originally for a computer to pass itself off as essentially a person. So, can a machine, the bar to set, the bar we're trying to reach in doing poetry well is not just doing what a high schooler can do, particularly gifted high schoolers notwithstanding. We're talking about real poetry. That brings us to a question of what is real poetry and what is its relationship with thought, which is its own grand subject that I need to investigate more, and I have plans to write a little bit about later this year, but I need to think about it more. where I'm at is it has to do with the ability to see connections between unrelated things and to describe things in terms not usually used to describe the things. One of the lines that Adam Nicholson brought up from the Iliad, is it the Iliad or was it the Odyssey? Might have been the Odyssey. Is the Proto-Indo-European root language Greek, Mycenaean, Ionian. It's Homeric Greek is its own weird thing, but they didn't have a lot of adjectives to describe the ocean, so they described the waves of the ocean as the broad ridges, the broad backs of the sea. That's steppe language. It's describing the ocean in terms of the land. One of my wife's favorite books was a young adult book called Fly By Night by Frances Hardinge. And there's a beautiful little description in there where, just a throwaway little line, where they're at some dock. And the dock has seagulls circling over the dock like tea leaves being stirred in a teacup. What a beautiful, perfect, descriptive image. And who would think to describe seagulls circling like, it even gets like the pace right, you know? You couldn't describe vultures circling that way. It would be too fast. There's something just so perfect about that. And Ian asked, you know, does it have to do with the computer's inability, like lack of experience? Perhaps, you know. There are passages in Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, that suggest that maybe Homer didn't have a lot of firsthand experience of what he was talking about. Maybe, you know, or maybe he compromised some knowledge in order to make things work. Who knows? I don't know if it's experience. I think experience certainly helps, but it's a creative capacity to visualize a connection between things that matches what other people see. Because at the end of the day, the quality of poetry comes down to, does this capture the imagination of the people who read it? You know, do they see the same things in the poem that you intended them to see? It's not like the, you know, the high school bad poetry lines where she smiled like an upside down frown, or he fell down the stairs like someone falling down the stairs. You know, these things that just kind of, they don't create quite the right visual image for a variety of reasons. So that creative capacity to visualize similarities between unlike things, maybe you could program AI to do that. But I think you would have to, it would be a challenge to program. It would be a challenge to get AI to do that in a way that it's not recycling stale stuff. Because that's the other problem. If a metaphor becomes too stale, it doesn't work anymore. You know, and this is another thing George Orwell talked about. You have to always be looking for new things, because the old visual metaphors, once they get overused, like if you've ever written out the word blue one too many times, it starts looking wrong, like it doesn't work anymore. But third and finally, and maybe this is an insurmountable problem for AI, I don't know, you run into the death of the author problem, or the not death of the author. Because I'm not a believer in the death of the author theory. The idea that we read and experience literature completely apart from any information about the author. I think we can't help but think of the writing in terms of the author, in terms of what we know about the author. And when we're reading poetry, we can appreciate poetry if we don't know anything about the author. But the authorship adds a layer of depth to the poem. And if we know that a poem is written by artificial intelligence, that knowledge creates an insurmountable gap in connection that I think is a part of our experience of poetry. So that's maybe a little bit of bigotry the human race holds against computers and machines. I don't know what we're going to do about that. If anything needs to be done about it, maybe that's fine. But the bigger and more poignant present problem that programs like ChatGPT can't seem to overcome. Because you can tell ChatGPT to put together a haiku, to put together a sonnet, and it can do it like that, and it can do it really well. But it can do it really well in the way that a high school A student or a college undergrad can do it. It conforms to the structure. Maybe it's got like good rhythm. It's got interesting word choice, and it does it really fast, which is cool. But it lacks a certain originality of vision that defines poetry and that makes poetry valuable. It's not so much that poetry is like the substance of life in the way that Robin Williams talks about in Dead Poets Society, although for some people maybe that's true. It's more like the ability to see these connections and to craft your own words or your own phrases out of existing words is something approaching the substance of thought itself. And so if your entire structure of thought, or responding rather, is to aggregate inputs and then to algorithmically output some ad-lib in response, which is what ChatGPT does, it's what large language models do, it's what they are. That is their structure. And frankly, it's how many people think, and it's how many people write. That will never generate an original poem, an original phrase. It will never generate an original thought either. So there's a structural barrier for large language models in poetizing in that way. And despite the prefabricated phrases that Homer was using, the larger creative vision that was at work in the sort of jigsawing together of these two epic poems, well, one epic poem. The Odyssey was a little bit more prose, but like there's still that creative poetic vision there. So the Orwell concern of using prefabricated phrases is real, and it's a useful tell, and it's an important thing to be mindful of, but I don't think it's the be-all end-all of creative writing and poetry. It's a starting point in understanding the mechanism of poetry, the mechanism of good writing versus the mechanism of bad writing, and how to live in the world, how to look around and observe and be in the world as a poet might be, rather than as a machine might be. So I hope that answers the question. I'm doing the best I can without any kind of script or prompt or even the original question in front of me, but I hope I did a decent job of remembering the substance of the prompt, and in as imperfect of an answer as this was, I at least hope I gave some interesting food for thought and the sort of starting point for a hypothesis of how Homer might be able to create arguably some of the greatest poetry in history from prefabricated phrases, while modern writers attempting to do the same cannot. So thanks so much for listening, and take care.